Imagine this. You're not dreaming, you're not reading Dante or watching a horror film. You're in London, the year 1531, and you are being lowered slowly into a cauldron of boiling water. Not all at once, inch by inch. Your skin peels back like wet paper. Your nerves scream louder than your mouth, and above you the crowd watches, silent, some in terror, some in awe, some in morbid delight, because this is justice, royal justice. This is not the fate of a war criminal, nor a mad heretic. No, this is the punishment for a cook, a man named Richard Roos, a servant who prepared a bowl of porridge that killed 2 and sickened more. And for that, he boiled. Not in secret, not in shame, but in full daylight, by command of the king himself, Henry VIII, the same king who would later split from Rome, marry 6 times, and rule with godlike power over the bodies and souls of his people. But here, in this moment, he doesn't need swords or decrees. He needs a pot. A very large, very public boiling pot. What kind of world demands this punishment? What kind of fear drives a monarch to invent such a law? What crime is so corrosive, so subversive, that it warrants the most grotesque execution ever written into the books of English justice? To answer that, we must look deeper, not just at the crime, but at the king, the church, the shifting tectonics of power in Tudor England. Because Richard Roos wasn't just a cook. He was a message, a warning. A man turned into fire and steam so that no one, not bishop nor beggar, would dare defy the will of the crown. This is not merely a story about a death. It's a story about power, about spectacle, about what happens when a man believes himself chosen not to rule by law, but to be the law. And it begins, like all tragedies, with a simple meal. Part 1, the boiling point of a kingdom. England in the early 1530s was not a land at peace. Beneath its gilded ceremonies and grand cathedrals, the kingdom trembled with unseen fault lines. King Henry VIII, once the darling of the Renaissance, was beginning to cast off the velvet gloves of diplomacy in favor of something harder, sharper. He wanted a son, a male heir to secure the Tudor legacy. But his wife, Queen Catherine of Aragon, had failed to produce one. Years of hope had turned to bitterness. And now, Henry wanted an annulment. The Pope refused, so the king began to imagine a world in which he no longer needed papal blessing at all. The church, once sacred and untouchable, became a battlefield. Bishops and cardinals were no longer men of God. They were obstacles, political factions sharpened like knives in the dark. Loyalties were tested, then shattered. Every word spoken in court might carry the weight of treason. And in this atmosphere of suspicion and sacred defiance, a bowl of porridge changed everything. Richard Roos was not a man of politics. He was not a reformer nor a rebel. He was a cook, nothing more. He served in the household of Bishop John Fisher, one of the few men in England bold enough to openly defy the king's desire to cast Catherine aside. Fisher believed in papal supremacy and divine order. He saw Henry's ambitions not as political maneuvering, but as heresy wrapped in a crown. This made Fisher dangerous. It made everyone around him dangerous by proximity. And so, when members of his household began to fall ill after eating a simple meal, when 2 of them died, alarm bells rang louder than church bells. The porridge had been tampered with. Roos admitted it. He claimed it was a prank, a joke. He had added something to cause discomfort, he said, not death. But in Tudor England, even discomfort could be treason when aimed at the wrong stomach. It was too perfect, too suspicious. A bishop who opposed the king falls ill. His poor guests die. The man responsible worked in his kitchen. Whether it was malice, mischief, or manipulation didn't matter anymore. In that moment, the truth bowed to the needs of power. Roos became a symbol, not of poison, but of subversion. In a kingdom teetering between Rome and Reformation, between divine law and royal will, his crime, real or imagined, was a gift. A chance for the king to send a message, not just to bishops, but to everyone, every cook, every priest, every loyal subject. The crown was not to be trifled with. The king's justice would no longer be bound by tradition, and the fires of political transformation would need more than parchment and ink. They would need flame and flesh and boiling water. Part 2. A law written in steam. What followed was not a trial. It was a transformation. The machinery of Tudor justice did not simply turn its wheels. It reinvented itself to crush Richard Roos. In the past, even the worst criminals were afforded some semblance of due process. But not this time. Henry VIII was not interested in precedent or mercy. He did not want Roos to be judged by a jury or punished by existing law. He wanted to make an example so terrifying, so unforgettable, that it would echo through every kitchen and cathedral in the land. So he created a new law. From nothing. A special Act of Parliament was drafted and passed with frightening speed. The Act for Poisoning of 1531. It declared that poisoning was not just murder, but high treason, a direct assault on the crown itself. It redefined the act as an abomination so profound that it required a punishment outside the known world. Boiling alive, that was the sentence. No hanging, no beheading, no last words or swift justice, just steam and agony and screams echoing off stone. And the most chilling detail, the law was retroactive. It applied not only to future crimes, but also to the one already committed. Roos had been condemned by a law that did not exist when he stirred that fatal pot. Even by the brutal standards of Tudor England, this was a legal perversion, a betrayal of the ancient principle that no man can be punished under a law passed after the fact. But Henry no longer cared for principles. He had begun to see himself as more than a man, more than a king. He was becoming the law itself, his will made flesh, his desires translated into statutes by a parliament too fearful to refuse. With each decree, he chipped away at the old order, the medieval balance between crown and church, king and conscience. And in that vacuum of checks and balances, his cruelty found a new stage. The very method of execution was chosen with surgical intent. Roos had used a pot to poison. Now he would be undone by one. Poetic justice, the king called it. A punishment not just of the body, but of the soul. A reversal of tools. A cook destroyed by the same object he once used to feed. This was not simply retribution. It was symbolism carved in flesh. The xenophobic undertones of the new law were unmistakable. The text declared poisoning a foreign crime, one not native to England, a disease brought in from beyond. In branding it thus, Henry cast himself not merely as a king enforcing justice, but as a protector of the realm's purity, a guardian against contamination, spiritual, political, and now even culinary. The message was clear. There would be no tolerance for hidden threats, no patience for subversion, and no mercy for those who dared to taint the king's household, his kingdom, or his ego. For Richard Roos, it no longer mattered what he had intended. The porridge, the prank, the deaths, they had all become irrelevant. His fate was no longer about what he did, it was about what he represented. Vulnerability, betrayal, and the need for fear. He would not just be executed, he would be erased, dissolved in boiling water, until even the bones of tradition softened in the heat of the king's wrath. Part 3. Smithfield's Cauldron. April 5th, 1531. The streets of London pulsed with the low thrum of anticipation. Word had spread, carried from lips to ears like gossip dipped in poison. A man was to be boiled alive, not burned, not hanged, not drawn and quartered, but lowered inch by inch into water heated to a furious, bubbling rage. The place was Smithfield, a name already soaked in blood, long used for executions, heretics, and rebels. But this was different. Even in an age where death was public and punishment theatrical, boiling was alien. It felt older, crueler, pagan almost. A crowd gathered, thick as fog. Merchants, beggars, clergy, nobles cloaked in furs, they all came. Not out of justice, not out of outrage, but out of something far more dangerous, curiosity. What does a man sound like when his skin peels from his bones? What color does flesh turn when it boils? These were questions the king had arranged for them to witness. At the center stood the cauldron, large and crude, filled with water, heated by fire so intense the air above it shimmered and warped. Some said it hissed like a dragon, some said it sang. Then came Richard Roos, shackled and stripped. A man no longer a man in the eyes of the law, but a symbol, an object lesson. They say he was pale, they say he wept. They say he still claimed it was a prank gone wrong. But no one listened. The law had spoken, and the crowd had not come for explanations. They had come for pain, Accounts differ on how it happened. Some say he was dropped in whole, others that he was lowered slowly, in stages to prolong the agony. What is certain is this: he screamed, loudly, fiercely, a scream not of a man dying, but of a man unmade. Flesh met fire, and the air filled with the stench of cooking meat, a smell that would haunt those present long after they returned to their homes and hearths. Chroniclers noted that even the executioners looked uneasy, that some turned away, but the law demanded performance, and the king demanded spectacle. So they watched, and Roos boiled. No prayers were spoken, no burial recorded. Whatever remained of his body was likely discarded, perhaps even displayed. He died not as a person, but as a message, a grotesque warning boiled down to its purest form. And what did the people learn? That a cook could be a traitor, that a prank could be a death sentence, that the king could write a law, break a law, and burn a man alive without blinking. Smithfield would return to silence. The fire would die, the pot would cool, but the ghost of that scream would linger, rising like steam into the sky, reminding every witness that England's justice no longer wore robes of reason. It wore the crown. Part 4. The aftertaste of power. Richard Roos was gone, reduced to steam, bone, and memory. But his death did not end at Smithfield. It rippled outward, soaking into the parchment of law, into the stone of Parliament, into the marrow of Tudor England. The boiling had not merely destroyed a man, it had forged a precedent. And precedents in the hands of a king like Henry VIII were weapons far more enduring than swords. The act that condemned Roos remained. It did not fade with the fire. In fact, it would be used again. 11 years later, a woman named Margaret Davy was boiled alive for poisoning as well. Proof that Henry's law was no outburst, but a tool drawn when fear needed form. The law stood as a silent threat, that the crown could still conjure horror from thin air and write it into the bones of justice. Bishop John Fisher, whose household had been poisoned, found no vindication in Roos's suffering. He would soon face his own death, not from food, but from faith. His refusal to support the king's divorce and acknowledge Henry as supreme head of the church would earn him a beheading in 1535. The man who had once been poisoned would become a martyr, canonized as a saint. But none of this saved Roos. The boiling had already claimed its warning. The king had made his point. And what a point it was! Henry had bypassed the entire legal tradition of England to craft a punishment so brutal, so specific, it barely seemed real. A single man, accused of a single crime, led to the invention of a new form of execution and a new category of treason. This wasn't law, it was theatre. A performance staged to show that the king could rewrite the very rules of existence when it pleased him. Parliament, meant to be a brake on royal excess, had instead become its scribe. The act passed without resistance. Who would dare oppose a monarch who now claimed both earthly and divine authority? Who would speak for a cook when the kitchen had become a crucible for treason? And what of the people? Did they cheer? Did they flinch? The records do not say, but silence too is a form of complicity. And fear, once sown, grows deep roots. The boiling of Richard Roos marked more than a moment of cruelty. It marked a shift, a pivot in English governance where law no longer restrained power but served it, where punishment ceased to be a mirror of guilt and became instead a reflection of royal anxiety. Poisoning was no longer just a crime, it was a metaphor for foreignness, for secrecy, for hidden rebellion. And boiling was the exorcism. That day in Smithfield, something more than flesh burned. The rule of law, ancient and fragile, cracked in the heat. And from the steam rose a new England, colder, harder, more obedient. Part 5. A kingdom cooked from within. When Richard Roos vanished into the steam, he left behind more than the stench of scorched flesh. He left a blueprint for tyranny. The law that killed him had been built overnight, tailored to fit his crime like a coffin carved for one. But once written, it lingered. It outlived its purpose. It became part of the king's legal arsenal, a grotesque reminder that Parliament could be bent to the crown's will as easily as iron over flame. And that, perhaps, was the real terror. Not the boiling pot, but the silence that followed. No revolt, no protests, just acceptance, tight-lipped and terrified. Historians today call it ex post facto law, a principle universally condemned in modern justice. You cannot punish a man under a rule that didn't exist when he acted. But Henry did just that, and no one stopped him. Why? Because in Henry's England, power was no longer interpreted, it was declared. The king's word was law and his law was gospel. If a cook could be boiled for a prank, then what might happen to a bishop, a noble, a queen? This was the climate that birthed the English Reformation. Not just a theological rupture, but a complete redefinition of authority. The church, once the final judge, was pushed aside. The king now spoke for God, and his punishments echoed like scripture. Richard Roos's death was one thread in that tapestry, a minor, unimportant man whose final screams became part of the kingdom's foundation. And yet his execution tells us more about Tudor England than any royal proclamation. It shows how fear became policy, how ritual became propaganda, how punishment became theatre, designed not to rehabilitate, but to haunt. In time, the statute that condemned Roos would be repealed. In 1547, Henry's son, Edward VI, removed it as part of a broader effort to clean up the excesses of his father's reign. But the damage had been done. The idea that the law could be bent backwards, molded to suit political needs, had taken root. Modern audiences like to believe that justice has progressed, that we've left behind the boiling pots and bloodied axes. But look closely, and you'll see echoes of Roos everywhere. In retroactive legislation, in show trials, in punishment crafted more to terrify the many than to correct the few. The methods have changed, the message has not. Richard Roos never intended to make history. He was a cook, a servant, a man who, perhaps in foolishness or ignorance, caused harm and paid for it with more pain than most could imagine. His story is not one of innocence, nor entirely of guilt. It is the story of what happens when justice loses its spine and bends under the heat of power. The cauldron is cold now, the fire long dead, but the questions it raised about kings, laws, fear, and spectacle still simmer beneath the surface. And in every state that punishes first, explains later. In every ruler who rewrites rules mid-sentence. In every crowd that watches, wide-eyed and wordless, Roos still burns. Part 6. Steam never forgets. Centuries have passed since the cauldron at Smithfield cooled, but the ghost of Richard Roos still rises in vapors unseen. His name is barely whispered in history books, overshadowed by queens who lost their heads and kings who lost their minds. But in the long shadow of Tudor justice, his death remains one of its most disturbing echoes. Because his end was not designed to serve justice, it was crafted to perform power. Boiling a man alive is not punishment. It is a ritual, a ceremony of fear, a spectacle so grotesque that its memory outlasts its facts. That was the genius of Henry VIII. He didn't just want to kill a cook, he wanted to engrave obedience into the national consciousness, and he succeeded. Not through reasoned argument or godly inspiration, but through pain, heat, and silence. The lesson wasn't for Roos, it was for everyone else. For the bishop who dared speak against the king's divorce. For the parliament that might hesitate before passing the next royal decree. For the courtier whose loyalty wavered in whispers. For the woman who wondered whether the king had truly been chosen by God. In Tudor England, terror was governance, and Richard Roos became its chosen instrument. A man stripped of context, reduced to a symbol. Whether he intended to murder or merely jest no longer mattered. What mattered was that the king was threatened, and that threat demanded purification. So the water boiled, but something else happened that day at Smithfield. Something the king never intended. Yes, the people watched. Yes, they learned. But in that watching, something curdled beneath their skin. A quiet rot. A dread that no longer stirred rebellion, but settled deeper. Complicity. Because everyone in that crowd knew the truth. That justice, in its true form, had not visited Smithfield that morning. Only vengeance, dressed in royal robes. And the true horror, that vengeance felt normal. This is what happens when cruelty is normalized. Not just feared, not just accepted, but expected. It starts with a cook, then a bishop, then a wife, then an entire country, bent until it no longer remembers the shape of its own spine. The execution of Richard Roos is not merely a lesson in historical savagery, it's a blueprint. A case study in how easily fear becomes culture, and how quickly culture becomes law. When a government decides that law is whatever it says it is, and that punishment must terrify more than it corrects. Justice is no longer blind. It stares, unblinking, into the eyes of every subject and dares them to flinch. And we, centuries later, still carry the echoes. We see it in every law crafted for one man. Every sentence harsher because the crime embarrassed the state. Every leader who claims emergency as justification. Every public shaming designed not to heal, but to humiliate. We still boil, just not always with water. Perhaps the most terrifying part of Richard Roos's story isn't the death itself, but how easily it was done. With Parliament's blessing, with no revolt, with the silence of a nation still adjusting to the idea that its king was more than a man. He was a mouthpiece for God. That silence should haunt us more than the screams. Because if history shows us anything, it's that the tools of tyranny rarely die. They just wait, in laws, in language, in loopholes. All it takes is heat and a reason. So no, the steam has not vanished. It waits in the corners of courtrooms, in late-night legislation, in voices that say, just this once. Richard Roos was not the beginning. He was not the end. He was the boiling point. And we should all ask, how far are we from the next cauldron?